Let's take a gentle journey south, to the lands at the end of the world, where the Andes Mountains meet ancient forests and cold Pacific waters, where a people called the Mapuche have lived for thousands of years, in their land with a fierce love that empires could never break. Fact 1. The name Mapuche. The word Mapuche comes from their own language, Mapudungun, and it means simply people of the land. Mapu means earth or land, and Che means people. This wasn't just a name, it was an identity, a declaration of belonging. They were the land, and the land was them, woven together in ways that outsiders would spend centuries trying to understand and failing to break. To be Mapuche was to be inseparable from the forests, rivers, and mountains of their territory. Fact 2. The ancestral territory. 4,000 of years before Europeans arrived, the Mapuche lived in what we now call south-central Chile and parts of Argentina, a territory they called Wallmapu, the surrounding land. It stretched from the Itata River in the north to Chiloé Island in the south, from the Pacific Ocean to the Argentine Pampas. Imagine vast forests of araucaria trees, their umbrella-like crowns reaching toward the sky, rivers running cold and clear from mountain snowmelt, and valleys rich with life. This was their home, their sacred trust, the land of their ancestors. Fact 3. Ancient roots. The Mapuche have lived in their territory for at least 2,500 years, possibly much longer. Archaeological evidence shows their ancestors developing agriculture, pottery, and complex social structures long before the rise of the Inca Empire. They weren't a single unified nation, but rather a confederation of related groups. The Picunch in the north, the Mapuche in the central valleys, the Huilish in the south, and the Pehuenche in the Andean foothills. Each group had its own character, but all shared language, customs, and a fierce independence. Fact 4. Living with the land. The Mapuche practiced a form of agriculture that worked with the land rather than against it. They grew potatoes, quinoa, maize, and beans. They raised llamas in the higher elevations. They gathered pinones, the nutritious nuts of the araucaria tree, which could sustain families through long winters. They hunted guanaco and gathered wild plants. Their relationship with the land was reciprocal. They took what they needed, but always with respect, always with awareness that they were part of the land's living web, not its masters. Fact 5. The Ruca. The traditional Mapuche home was called a ruca, a large communal dwelling made from wood and thatch. Picture a structure that could house an extended family, with a central fire pit where smoke would rise and filter through the roof, keeping insects away and preserving food hung from the beams. The ruca was oriented according to ancestral tradition, its entrance facing east to greet the sun. It was more than shelter. It was the physical center of family life, where stories were told, decisions made, and traditions passed down through generations. Fact 6. Mapudungun language. The Mapuche language, Mapudungun, is an isolate, meaning it has no known relation to other language families. It's uniquely their own, evolved over thousands of years in their territory. The language is rich with words describing their landscape and way of life. It has complex verb forms that can express subtle distinctions of action, intention, and relationship. To speak Mapudungun was to think like Mapuche, to understand the world through their eyes. Colonial powers would spend centuries trying to erase this language, understanding that language and identity were inseparable. Fact 7. The Maki. Among the Mapuche, the spiritual leaders were called Maki, and they were usually women, though not exclusively. The Maki were healers, shamans, and intermediaries with the spirit world. They used herbal medicines, performed ceremonies, and entered trance states to communicate with ancestors and spirits. The Maki played a crucial role in maintaining spiritual balance, healing the sick, and advising their communities. They embodied the Mapuche understanding that the physical and spiritual worlds were not separate but intertwined, each affecting the other. Fact 8. Gen spirits. The Mapuche believed that every element of nature, every river, mountain, forest, and animal, had its own gen, a guardian spirit. There was Ngenko, spirit of water. Ngenmawida, spirit of the forest. Ngenmapu, spirit of the land. These spirits weren't distant deities but active presences that demanded respect and reciprocity. Before taking from the land, you would ask permission from the appropriate Ngen. This worldview made the Mapuche natural conservationists. You don't destroy what you know to be alive and aware, what you know will respond to how you treat it. And so, with images of ancient forests where every tree has a spirit, of families gathered around fires in wooden homes, of a language unique in all the world, and of a people whose very name means of the land, we rest here, letting these first threads of the Mapuche story settle over us like morning mist on mountain valleys. Fact 9. The Lonco. Mapuche society was organized around extended family groups, and each group had a Lonco, a leader chosen for wisdom, speaking ability, and proven character. The Lonco wasn't a king or dictator, but more like a respected elder whose authority came from consensus and respect. In times of peace, the Lonco would mediate disputes, organize communal work, and preserve traditions. This decentralized leadership structure meant the Mapuche had no single capital to capture, no throne to topple. To conquer them, you would have to defeat them valley by valley, community by community, a task that would prove nearly impossible. Fact 10. The Toki. In times of war, the Mapuche would select a Toki, a war leader chosen for military skill and courage. Unlike the Lonco, whose role was permanent, the Toki's authority lasted only as long as the conflict. Once peace returned, the Toki would return to being an ordinary member of the community. This system prevented the concentration of military power and showed the Mapuche understanding that war leaders and peace leaders required different qualities. It was a remarkably democratic approach to governance, especially for its time. Fact 11. The Waychafe Warriors. The Mapuche warriors, called Waychafe, were trained from youth in the use of traditional weapons. They fought with macanas, wooden clubs often decorated with carved faces. They used bows and arrows, slings, and spears. They were experts in their terrain, using the forests and mountains to their advantage. But they were also adaptable, quick to learn and incorporate new technologies when they encountered them. This combination of traditional knowledge and tactical flexibility would make them formidable opponents against far larger, better-equipped armies. Fact 12. The Inca Expansion. In the mid-1400s, the expanding Inca Empire reached the northern borders of Mapuche territory. The Inca, who had conquered vast territories across the Andes, confidently sent armies south under the Emperor Tupac Inca Yupanqui. They expected the Mapuche to submit as so many other peoples had. But the Mapuche refused. For decades, battles raged along the Mal River. The Mapuche used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and their intimate knowledge of the terrain. Eventually, the Inca gave up, establishing their southern border at the Mal River and building forts to defend against Mapuche raids. It was one of the few times the Inca expansion was successfully stopped. Fact 13. The Battle of the Mal. According to oral tradition, a massive three-day battle occurred at the Mal River around 1470. The Inca army, numbering perhaps 20,000, faced a Mapuche coalition of similar size. Neither side could break the other. On the third day, both armies withdrew, exhausted. The Inca emperor reportedly decided that conquering these fierce southern warriors wasn't worth the cost. The Mapuche had defended their independence against the most powerful empire in South America. It was a harbinger of resistances to come. The Mapuche would never accept subjugation, no matter how powerful their enemy. Fact 14. Trading networks. The Mapuche weren't isolated. They had extensive trading networks, both within their own territory and with neighboring peoples. They traded across the Andes with groups in what is now Argentina, exchanging Pacific fish and seaweed for guanaco hides and salt from the Pampas. They traded with northern groups for goods that had traveled all the way from the Inca Empire. These trade routes meant the Mapuche were aware of the wider world, receiving news and goods from distant places. When Spanish ships appeared on their coast, the Mapuche already knew something of what was happening in the north. Fact 15. The Guillotine Ceremony. One of the most important Mapuche ceremonies was the guillotine, a communal gathering held to maintain balance with the natural and spiritual worlds. The ceremony involved prayers, offerings, traditional music, and dance. Everyone participated. It was a community reaffirming its relationship with the land and spirits. The guillotine would be held to ask for good harvests, to prevent disasters, or to give thanks. These gatherings also served a social function, bringing together different family groups, strengthening bonds, arranging marriages, and reinforcing shared identity. The ceremony continues to this day, an unbroken thread connecting modern Mapuche to their ancestors. Fact 16. Textiles and silver. Mapuche women were skilled weavers, creating textiles on vertical looms with distinctive geometric patterns. Each pattern had meaning, telling stories, marking clan affiliations, or invoking spiritual protection. The Mapuche also became renowned silversmiths, though this craft flourished especially after contact with Europeans brought new silver sources. They created traralonco, silver headbands, and beautiful pectorals and jewelry. These weren't mere decorations but markers of identity, status, and spiritual significance. A Mapuche woman in traditional dress, adorned with silver jewelry and wrapped in a woven mantle, was a walking expression of her people's artistry and pride. Fact 17. The Spanish arrive. In 1540, Spanish conquistador Pedro de Valdivia entered Mapuche territory from the north, having already helped conquer the Inca Empire. He founded Santiago and began pushing south, establishing settlements in Mapuche lands. At first, some Mapuche groups were curious about these strange bearded foreigners with their horses and metal weapons. Some even helped the Spanish, not yet understanding what their arrival would mean. But Valdivia's intentions soon became clear. He wanted to enslave the Mapuche, to take their lands, to extract wealth. He was treating them as the Spanish had treated the peoples of Mexico and Peru. The Mapuche would respond differently. And so, with images of warriors defending river crossings against empire, of women weaving stories into cloth, of ceremonies that bind communities to land and spirit, and of strangers arriving with horses and ambitions, we rest here, letting these threads of independence and approaching storm drift through our thoughts like smoke from ceremonial fires. Fact 18. The Battle of Quilicura. In 1546, the Mapuche inflicted their first major defeat on the Spanish at the Battle of Quilicura. Spanish forces under Pedro de Valdivia faced a Mapuche army and were routed, losing horses, weapons, and men. For the Spanish, who had grown accustomed to easy victories over indigenous peoples, this was shocking. The Mapuche weren't intimidated by horses or guns. They studied Spanish tactics, learned their weaknesses, and fought with coordinated strategy. Quilicura was just the beginning. It announced that the Mapuche would not submit, that this land would be defended, that conquest would not be easy. Fact 19. Lautaro the Student. Among the Mapuche captured and enslaved by Valdivia was a young man named Lautaro. He was forced to serve as Valdivia's stable hand, caring for the horses that terrified most Mapuche. But Lautaro was learning. He watched how the Spanish fought, how they organized their cavalry, how they commanded. He learned to ride horses himself, understanding that these animals weren't magical creatures but tools that could be mastered. He studied the Spanish weaknesses, their arrogance, their predictability, their dependence on their horses. And when he escaped back to his people, Lautaro brought knowledge that would change everything. Fact 20. Lautaro's Tactics. Lautaro became a Toki and revolutionized Mapuche warfare. He taught his people to fight in shifts, with fresh warriors constantly replacing tired ones, wearing down the Spanish who fought in heavy armor in the summer heat. He trained Mapuche cavalry to counter the Spanish horsemen. He used pits and traps to neutralize Spanish advantages. He attacked Spanish supply lines and isolated outposts rather than fortified cities. Lautaro understood that you didn't need to match Spanish technology. You needed to make their technology irrelevant. His tactical genius would influence Mapuche resistance for centuries to come. Fact 21. The death of Valdivia. On Christmas Day, 1553, at the Battle of Tucapel, Lautaro's forces ambushed and destroyed a Spanish force, capturing Pedro de Valdivia himself. The conquistador who had founded Santiago and declared himself governor of Chile was brought before the Mapuche. According to tradition, they executed him, some sources saying they poured molten gold down his throat as punishment for his greed. Whether this detail is true or not, the symbolism was powerful. The Spanish conqueror had fallen to the people he tried to enslave. The man who thought he could replicate Pizarro's conquest of Peru had instead met his end in the forests of the south. Fact 22. Lautaro's offensive. After Valdivia's death, Lautaro didn't simply defend, he attacked. He led Mapuche forces north, destroying Spanish settlements, liberating enslaved Mapuche, pushing toward Santiago itself. The Spanish were terrified. Settlers abandoned their homes and fled north. For a moment, it seemed Lautaro might drive the Spanish out of Chile entirely. But in 1557, while besieging a Spanish fort, Lautaro was killed in a surprise attack. He was only in his mid-20s. The Mapuche had lost their greatest military leader, but his legacy would inspire resistance for generations. He had shown that the Spanish could be defeated, that horses could be countered, that the invaders were not invincible. Fact 23. La Araucana. A Spanish soldier named Alonso de Ercilla fought in the Arauco War and witnessed Mapuche resistance firsthand. He was so impressed by their courage and military skill that he wrote an epic poem called La Araucana, published between 1569 and 1589. It was one of the first major works of literature about the Americas, and remarkably, it portrayed the Mapuche as noble, brave, and worthy opponents rather than savages. Ercilla wrote of Lautaro with admiration, describing Mapuche leaders as heroes in the classical tradition. The poem spread across Europe, making the Mapuche famous as warriors who successfully resisted Spain's empire. Fact 24. The destruction of the 7 cities. By 1598, the Spanish had established 7 settlements south of the Bio River: Angal, Imperial, Osorno, Valdivia, Virica, La Serena, and Concepcion's southern districts. These were meant to be permanent colonies in the heart of Mapuche territory. But in that year, coordinated Mapuche attacks destroyed all 7 cities. Tens of thousands of settlers were killed or fled north. The Spanish called it the Great Rebellion. It was actually a successful war of liberation. The Mapuche had pushed the Spanish back to the Bio River and established a de facto border that would hold for over 200 years. South of that river, the Mapuche remained free. Fact 25. The Bio frontier. The Bio River became one of history's most enduring frontiers. For over 250 years, from roughly 1600 to 1850, it marked the border between Spanish Chile and independent Mapuche territory. The Spanish built forts along the northern bank. The Mapuche controlled everything to the south. This wasn't a peaceful border. There were raids, skirmishes, and periodic wars. But it was a real border, acknowledged by both sides. The Spanish Empire, which had conquered the Aztecs and Incas, which ruled from California to Cape Horn, had to accept that it could not conquer the Mapuche. This small, decentralized people had achieved what no one else in the Americas had. They had forced the Spanish to recognize their independence. Fact 26. The Parlamentos. Unable to defeat the Mapuche militarily, the Spanish eventually began negotiating with them through meetings called Parlamentos. These were elaborate diplomatic gatherings where Spanish officials and Mapuche loncos would meet, exchange gifts, make speeches, and negotiate treaties. The Spanish would recognize Mapuche autonomy south of the Bio, and the Mapuche would agree to allow missionaries and traders. These parlamentos showed mutual recognition. The Spanish treated the Mapuche as a sovereign people, not subjects to be ruled. Between 1641 and 1803, there were dozens of parlamentos, each one reaffirming that the Mapuche remained independent within Spain's supposed empire. And so, with images of a young stable hand learning to ride his captor's horses, of 7 cities burning as their people reclaim their land, of rivers that mark the edge of empire, and of diplomatic gatherings where no one kneels, we rest here, letting these stories of resistance and recognition settle around us like the smoke from council fires on both sides of a river that neither side can cross. Fact 27. The Mestizo Frontier. Along the Bio frontier, something interesting happened. Despite the warfare, Spanish settlers and Mapuche communities traded, intermarried, and influenced each other. Children born of these unions created a mestizo population that blurred the boundaries. Spanish deserters sometimes fled south to live among the Mapuche. Mapuche traders traveled north to Spanish settlements. This frontier wasn't just a line of conflict. It was also a zone of cultural exchange, where two worlds met, mixed, and created something new. The Mapuche adopted horses, cattle, and wheat, while maintaining their own identity and autonomy. Fact 28. The Mapuche Cavalry. The Mapuche became some of the finest horsemen in the Americas. They bred their own horses from Spanish stock, developing a strong, hardy breed suited to their terrain. Mapuche cavalry could ride for days across mountains and forests. They developed new tactics specifically for mounted warfare, including the famous Malin, lightning-fast raids deep into enemy territory, striking quickly and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The very weapon the Spanish thought would guarantee victory. The horse had been mastered and turned against them. Fact 29. The Pampas Connection. Mapuche influence spread east across the Andes into the Argentine Pampas. Groups of Mapuche settled in Argentina, and their culture influenced the indigenous peoples of the plains. Trade routes across the Andes carried goods, ideas, and people in both directions. This trans-Andean connection meant the Mapuche had depth of territory and resources. If Spanish pressed too hard in Chile, they could retreat east. If threatened from Argentina, they could move west. They used geography as a defense, their territory spanning mountain passes that colonial armies found difficult to cross. Fact 30. The Jesuit Missions. Spanish Jesuits established missions in frontier areas, trying to convert the Mapuche to Christianity. Unlike many colonial religious orders, the Jesuits learned Mapudungun and attempted to understand Mapuche culture. Some Mapuche accepted Christianity, though often blending it with their traditional beliefs. The missions became trading posts and cultural meeting points. But the Jesuits also recognized Mapuche autonomy, operating with permission rather than occupation. When Spain expelled the Jesuits in 1767, many Mapuche regretted their departure, seeing them as less threatening than the soldiers and settlers who wanted their land. Fact 31. The Great Rebellion of 1723. Peace was never permanent on the frontier. In 1723, a massive Mapuche uprising erupted across the region. The immediate cause was Spanish encroachment on Mapuche lands and enslavement of captured warriors. But deeper causes ran through the relationship. The constant pressure, the broken promises, the fundamental incompatibility between Spanish colonialism and Mapuche independence. The rebellion lasted years, with thousands dying on both sides. Eventually, another parlamento was held, another treaty signed, another temporary peace established. The cycle of conflict, treaty, and renewed conflict had become the rhythm of the frontier. Fact 32. Mapuche adoption practices. The Mapuche sometimes captured Spanish settlers during raids and incorporated them into their communities. Children especially were adopted and raised as Mapuche, learning the language, customs, and identity. Some became completely integrated, defending their adopted people against their birth culture. This practice horrified the Spanish but revealed something important about Mapuche identity. It wasn't purely about bloodline but about belonging, about living as Mapuche. It showed a society confident enough to absorb outsiders, flexible enough to make them family, strong enough to maintain identity despite incorporating diversity. Fact 33. Trade and wealth. By the 18th century, the Mapuche had developed a prosperous economy based on cattle ranching and trade. They raised thousands of cattle, trading hides and dried meat to both Spanish Chile and across the Andes to Argentina. Some Mapuche Loncos became wealthy, owning large herds and trading extensively. This economic power reinforced their independence. They weren't primitive people hiding in forests. They were successful pastoralists and traders operating a cross-Andean economy. They participated in colonial markets while remaining politically independent, a unique position in colonial Latin America. Fact 34. The Parliament of Negrete. In 1726, at Negrete, one of the most important parlamentos was held. The Spanish formally recognized the Bio River as the border and acknowledged Mapuche sovereignty south of it. They agreed to limit missionary activity and respect Mapuche lands. In return, the Mapuche agreed to peace and trade. The treaty was symbolically important. The Spanish king's representative was recognizing that His Majesty's authority ended at a river in South America, beyond which the Mapuche ruled themselves. It was an admission of colonial limits, written into formal treaty. For over a century afterward, this basic arrangement would hold, however imperfectly. Fact 35. Cultural continuity. Throughout the colonial period, the Mapuche maintained their cultural practices, their language, their spiritual beliefs. They held guillotine ceremonies, consulted their maki, told their traditional stories. Children learned from elders. Knowledge passed from generation to generation, unbroken despite centuries of warfare and pressure. The Spanish might control the land north of the river, but they couldn't control Mapuche minds, couldn't erase Mapuche memory, couldn't break the transmission of culture from parents to children. This continuity, this refusal to forget who they were, might be the most important resistance of all. And so, with images of mounted warriors riding across mountain passes, of treaties signed and broken and signed again, of children learning their ancestors' language while tending cattle in vast herds, and of a people maintaining themselves through centuries of storm, we rest here, letting these threads of adaptation and persistence weave through our thoughts like the patterns in woven cloth. Fact 36. The Independence Wars. In the early 1800s, Spain's American colonies began fighting for independence. Chile's patriots, led by Bernardo O'Higgins and others, sought Mapuche support against Spanish royalists. The Mapuche were divided. Some supported the patriots, hoping an independent Chile would respect their autonomy better than Spain had. Others supported the royalists, suspicious of the patriots' intentions. Some remained neutral, watching as the colonizers fought among themselves. The Mapuche played crucial roles in several battles, their cavalry proving decisive. They didn't realize yet that independence would bring not freedom, but a new threat more dangerous than Spain had ever been. Fact 37. Broken promises. The Chilean patriots promised the Mapuche that independence would bring recognition of their sovereignty, that the new republic would honor the treaties Spain had signed. Some Mapuche leaders believed these promises. They fought alongside O'Higgins, their cavalry charging against Spanish forces. But once Chile gained independence in 1818, the promises were quickly forgotten. The new Chilean government saw the Mapuche territory the same way Spanish colonists had, as empty land waiting to be settled, as resources waiting to be exploited. The republic would prove far more effective at conquest than the empire had ever been. Fact 38. The young republic's ambitions. The newly independent Chile was a small country, squeezed between the Andes and the Pacific. Its leaders looked south at Mapuche territory, millions of acres of forests, farmland, and grazing pastures that could support European immigration and economic growth. They looked at Argentina making similar plans. A race was developing. Which republic would conquer the Mapuche first? Chilean intellectuals wrote that the Mapuche lands were wasted on their indigenous inhabitants, that civilization needed to replace barbarism. The language of progress and modernity masked the same old hunger for land and resources. Fact 39. The Mapuche population. By the mid-1800s, estimates suggest there were perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 Mapuche living in their traditional territory. They were organized into hundreds of independent communities, each with its own lonco. They still held guillotine ceremonies, still spoke Mapudungun, still identified as Mapuche. They had survived Spanish colonialism for 3 centuries. Now they faced something potentially more dangerous: modern nation-states with better weapons, larger populations, and ideologies of racial superiority and manifest destiny that justified any atrocity in the name of progress. Fact 40. Early Chilean encroachment. Through the 1830s and 1840s, Chilean settlers gradually pushed south of the Biobío. The government established new forts and settlements, claiming the land was being civilized. Mapuche communities found themselves surrounded by Chilean farms, their traditional lands being fenced and claimed by colonists. Some Mapuche sold land to settlers, not understanding Chilean property law or being cheated in transactions. Others resisted, leading to skirmishes and raids. The Chilean military responded with punitive expeditions, burning Mapuche villages and crops. The old frontier was collapsing, and the Mapuche were being slowly strangled. Fact 41. The last Parlamento. In 1825, the Chilean government held what would be the last traditional Parlamento with the Mapuche at Tipihu. The government promised to respect Mapuche autonomy and previous treaties. The Mapuche agreed to peace and cooperation. But it was an empty ceremony. The Chilean government had no intention of honoring these promises. They were buying time, waiting until they were strong enough to simply take what they wanted. The tradition of parlamentos, which had maintained an imperfect peace for 2 centuries, was ending. The age of negotiation was over. The age of conquest was beginning. Fact 42. The Argentine Campaign. Across the Andes, Argentina faced the same problem: indigenous peoples occupying lands the new republic wanted. In the 1870s, Argentina launched the Conquest of the Desert, a military campaign that was actually genocidal warfare against the indigenous peoples of the Pampas, including Mapuche who had migrated east. General Julio Argentino Roca led the campaign, killing thousands, destroying communities, and opening the Pampas to European settlement. The Mapuche watched Argentina's brutal conquest, knowing Chile was preparing something similar. They were being surrounded, with enemies on both sides of the mountains. Fact 43. The Pacification of Araucania. In 1861, Chile formally launched what it euphemistically called the Pacification de la Araucanía. The Pacification of Araucania. It wasn't pacification. It was conquest. It was invasion. Chilean military forces, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, pushed into Mapuche territory. They built forts and roads, establishing permanent military presence. They burned villages, destroyed crops, killed livestock, and drove Mapuche communities from their ancestral lands. The Chilean army had repeating rifles and cannons against Mapuche forces still fighting primarily with lances and captured weapons. The technological gap that Lautaro had once cleverly navigated was now overwhelming. Fact 44. Mapuche resistance continues. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, the Mapuche resisted fiercely. They ambushed Chilean supply convoys, raided settlements, and fought desperate battles against superior forces. Toqui after Toqui emerged to lead resistance. Quilipan, Quilhuec, and others whose names deserve to be remembered as heroes defending their homeland. The Mapuche adapted their tactics again, using guerrilla warfare, fighting from hidden positions in forests and mountains. But this time, adaptation wasn't enough. Chile had the resources to sustain a long campaign, to build permanent forts, to slowly strangle Mapuche independence through sheer persistence and numbers. And so, with images of promises made and broken, of cavalry charges against cannons, of forests burning and villages emptied, and of a people facing their darkest hour with the same fierce courage their ancestors had shown, we rest here, letting these painful chapters settle over us like ash from burning homes, acknowledging that some stories must speak of sorrow before they can speak of survival. Fact 45. The Fall of Angal. By 1862, the Chilean army had re-established the city of Angal, which the Mapuche had destroyed centuries before. It became a base for further military operations, a permanent garrison in the heart of Mapuche territory. The symbolism was clear. Chile was reversing the victories of 1598, reclaiming what the Mapuche had won. For the Mapuche watching Chilean flags fly over rebuilt Spanish ruins, it must have felt like history running backward, like their ancestors' victories being erased. Fact 46. Disease as weapon. As in other conquests of indigenous peoples, disease played a terrible role. Smallpox and other European diseases swept through Mapuche communities, killing thousands. Whether intentionally spread or simply a consequence of increased contact, disease accomplished what armies alone could not. Entire communities were devastated. Traditional healing practices couldn't cure these foreign plagues. The Maki, whose medicines had worked for thousands of years, were helpless against infections their ancestors had never encountered. The invisible enemy of epidemic joined the visible enemy of invasion. Fact 47. Land theft legalized. As the Chilean military secured territory, the government passed laws to legalize the theft of Mapuche land. They declared most Mapuche land, fiscals, state property. They auctioned it to settlers, mostly European immigrants and Chilean elites. Mapuche who had lived on land for generations suddenly found themselves legally dispossessed, their claims not recognized by Chilean law. Some communities were confined to small reductions, tiny reserves that were a fraction of their traditional territory. The legal framework of property law became a weapon as effective as any rifle. Fact 48. The final major battle. In 1881, at the Battle of Cerro Nilol, near what is now Temuco, the Chilean army defeated the last major organized Mapuche resistance. Thousands of Mapuche warriors faced modern artillery and repeating rifles. They fought bravely, charging positions they knew meant death, refusing to surrender their homeland without a fight. But courage couldn't stop bullets. The battle ended in defeat. Within 2 years, Chilean military control extended throughout former Mapuche territory. The war that had lasted, in various forms, for over 340 years was effectively over. Chile had finally accomplished what Spain never could. Fact 49. Quilipan's surrender. In 1883, the great Toqui Quilipan, who had led resistance for years, was forced to surrender. He was captured and imprisoned. The last major Mapuche military leader had fallen. Quilipan's surrender marked the end of Mapuche political and military independence. But it wasn't the end of the Mapuche people or their resistance. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A shift from military resistance to cultural survival, from fighting with weapons to fighting with words, memory, and persistence. Fact 50. The reduction system. The Chilean government forcibly relocated Mapuche communities to reductions, small plots of often poor-quality land. Extended families who had ranged over vast territories were squeezed onto a few acres. The reductions were designed to break up traditional social structures, to force Mapuche to abandon their semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyle and become sedentary farmers. Land that had sustained herds of cattle and horses couldn't support families in such small areas. Malnutrition and poverty became endemic. The reductions weren't reservations. They were open-air prisons designed to destroy a way of life. Fact 51. Loss of territory. By 1900, the Mapuche had lost approximately 95% of their traditional territory. Millions of acres had been seized by the Chilean state and distributed to settlers. The ancestral lands where guillotine had been held for thousands of years, where generations were buried, where every mountain and river had names in Mapudungun. All gone, divided up among strangers who saw only resources to exploit. For a people whose very name meant people of the land, this dispossession was a wound that went beyond the physical. It was an amputation of identity itself. Fact 52. Cultural suppression. With military conquest came cultural suppression. Chilean authorities tried to force assimilation. They banned traditional ceremonies, or severely restricted them. They established schools where Mapuche children were forbidden to speak Mapudungun and punished for practicing their culture. Teachers beat children for speaking their own language. The goal was explicit: to eliminate Mapuche identity, to turn Mapuche into Chileans, to erase difference in the name of national unity. It was cultural genocide, the systematic attempt to destroy a people not by killing them but by erasing who they were. Fact 53. The survival of Mapudungun. Despite everything, despite the schools, the punishment, the shame imposed on their language, Mapudungans survived. Parents taught their children in secret. Elders preserved oral traditions. In remote communities, especially in the mountains, the language continued unbroken. Some words were lost, some traditions changed, but the language lived. Every time a grandmother whispered to her grandchild in Mapudungun, every time a story was told in the old way, it was an act of resistance. Language became the battleground where the war for identity continued. And so, with images of the last warriors laying down their lances, of families crowded onto land too small to sustain them, of children punished for speaking their parents' language, and yet of that language still whispered in the night, still passed from old to young, we rest here, letting these hard truths settle, honoring both the wound and the refusal to let the wound be final. Fact 54. European colonization. The Chilean government actively recruited European settlers to occupy former Mapuche lands. Germans, Swiss, French, and Italian immigrants were offered land, supplies, and financial incentives to settle in Araucania. Towns with German names appeared where Mapuche villages had stood. European-style houses replaced ruca. Wheat fields covered land where Araucaria forests had grown. The landscape itself was being transformed, its indigenous character erased, replaced with a transplanted European identity. The settlers, often poor farmers seeking a better life, became unwitting tools of colonization. Fact 55. Mapuche poverty. By the early 1900s, the Mapuche had gone from being prosperous cattle ranchers to being among the poorest people in Chile. Confined to inadequate land, denied access to credit and markets, facing discrimination in every interaction with Chilean society, many Mapuche families struggled with hunger and poverty. The economic independence that had helped sustain their political independence was gone. Poverty became another tool of oppression, making resistance harder, making survival itself a daily struggle that left little energy for fighting broader injustices. Fact 56. The Maki persist. Through all the changes, the Maki continued their role. They still healed, still communicated with spirits, still maintained the spiritual traditions. Chilean authorities tried to suppress them, calling them witches and charlatans. But communities protected their Maki, understanding that they represented continuity with the past, a connection to ancestors and spirits that couldn't be severed by laws or guns. The Maki adapted too, some incorporating Christian elements, but always maintaining the core of Mapuche spirituality. They were guardians not just of health but of identity itself. Fact 57. Oral traditions preserved. The Mapuche had no written language before European contact, so their history lived in oral tradition. After conquest, these oral traditions became even more important. Elders became living libraries, memorizing genealogies going back generations, preserving stories of ancestors, remembering the old ways. Young people would sit with elders, learning, memorizing, becoming the next generation of tradition keepers. What couldn't be written down had to be remembered, and remember they did. The past lived in human memory, passed mouth to ear, generation after generation. Fact 58. The Araucaria trees. The Araucaria tree, whose nuts had sustained the Mapuche for millennia, became a symbol of their struggle. These ancient trees, some over 1,000 years old, were cut down by Chilean forestry companies for timber. Entire forests disappeared. The Pehuenche people, whose name meant people of the Araucaria, watched their namesake trees being destroyed. But some forests survived in the mountains, and the Mapuche fought to protect them. The Araucaria became more than a tree. It was identity, history, resistance. To defend the trees was to defend themselves. Fact 59. Migration to cities. As life on the reductions became increasingly difficult, many Mapuche migrated to Chilean cities, especially Santiago and Temuco, seeking work and opportunities. In cities, they faced new challenges: discrimination, poverty, the difficulty of maintaining traditional practices in urban environments. But they also found new forms of community, establishing Mapuche neighborhoods, organizations, and support networks. Urban Mapuche developed new ways of being Mapuche, adapting their identity to city life while maintaining connection to their rural communities and culture. Fact 60. Early 20th century resistance. Despite military defeat, resistance continued in new forms. In 1910, a Mapuche man named Manuel Alberto Panguilef founded the Sociedad Católica, one of the first modern Mapuche political organizations. It advocated for land rights, education, and recognition. Panguilef traveled to communities, organized meetings, published a newspaper in Spanish and Mapudungun. The resistance was moving from armed struggle to political organizing, from military tactics to legal and social activism. The tools changed, but the goal remained the same: defending Mapuche rights and identity. Fact 61. The Lost Generation. In the early and mid-1900s, a generation of Mapuche grew up caught between worlds. In schools, they were taught to be ashamed of their identity, to see Mapuche culture as backward and inferior. Many stopped speaking Mapudungun, stopped practicing traditions, tried to assimilate into Chilean society to escape discrimination. Some succeeded in joining the Chilean middle class, but often at the cost of cultural connection. Others remained trapped in poverty, neither fully Mapuche nor fully Chilean. It was a generation marked by cultural confusion, shame, and loss. Fact 62. The Textile Revival. Even as much was being lost, some traditions persisted and even flourished. Mapuche women continued weaving, creating textiles with traditional patterns and techniques. These textiles became not just art but political statements, visible declarations of Mapuche identity. A woman wearing a traditional chamal, adorned with silver jewelry, was announcing herself as Mapuche, refusing to disappear into Chilean society. The textiles connected present to past, daughters to grandmothers, communities to ancestors. Thread and wool became threads of continuity. And so, with images of ancient trees standing witness to change, of women's hands moving across looms weaving patterns older than conquest, of elders teaching young ones the stories that must not be forgotten, and of communities finding new ways to be themselves in a world that insisted they become someone else, we rest here, letting these threads of persistence weave through darkness, understanding that survival itself can be revolution. Fact 63. The Mid-Century Awakening. By the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of Mapuche activists emerged. They were educated, bilingual, able to navigate Chilean society while maintaining Mapuche identity. They founded organizations, wrote manifestos, demanded land reform and recognition. They were influenced by global indigenous rights movements, by decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. They saw their struggle as part of a worldwide awakening of indigenous peoples. The sleeping giant of Mapuche resistance was stirring again, this time armed with lawyers and typewriters alongside traditional authority. Fact 64. Allende's reforms. When Salvador Allende became president of Chile in 1970, his government promised land reform that would benefit indigenous communities. Some Mapuche communities began recovering small portions of their ancestral lands through legal means. Hope flickered. Perhaps the Chilean state could be reformed, could acknowledge historical injustice and make amends. Mapuche organizations worked with Allende's government, seeing an opening for change. But this hope would be brutally cut short by what came next. Fact 65. The Pinochet coup. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup that overthrew Allende's government. The dictatorship that followed would last 17 years and would be particularly brutal toward the Mapuche. Pinochet saw indigenous rights movements as communist threats. Mapuche activists were arrested, tortured, killed, or disappeared. Land reform was reversed. The small gains made under Allende were erased. The dictatorship represented not just political oppression but a return to the old colonial attitudes that saw indigenous peoples as obstacles to be removed. Fact 66. The Decree Law 2568. In 1979, Pinochet's government passed Decree Law 2568, which formally ended the reduction system. This sounds positive, but the reality was more complex. The law allowed reductions to be divided and sold as individual private property. This broke up communal land holdings, the last remnants of traditional Mapuche land tenure. It opened the door for Mapuche to sell their small plots out of desperation, often to logging and agricultural companies. What little land remained was further fragmented. The law was framed as giving Mapuche equal rights under Chilean law, but it was really the final assault on communal land ownership. Fact 67. Resistance under dictatorship. Despite the dangers, Mapuche resistance continued under Pinochet. It was more careful, more underground, but it didn't stop. Communities protected activists, hid documents, maintained organizations in secret. The Maki continued their ceremonies. People continued teaching Mapudungun to their children. Cultural practices that had survived conquests survived dictatorship too. The military might have controlled the cities and roads, but it couldn't control every mountain valley, couldn't be everywhere at once. In the spaces between military checkpoints, Mapuche identity persisted. Fact 68. The forest companies. During and after the Pinochet era, large forestry companies moved into Mapuche territories, planting vast monoculture forests of pine and eucalyptus for timber and paper production. These plantations replaced native forests, drained water sources, and destroyed biodiversity. Communities found themselves surrounded by pine forests, their water sources drying up, their traditional medicine plants disappearing. The companies, often owned by Chile's wealthiest families, became the new face of colonialism, corporate rather than military, but equally devastating to Mapuche lands and livelihoods. Fact 69. Return to democracy. In 1990, Chile returned to democracy. The new government promised to address indigenous rights. In 1993, Chile passed the Indigenous Law, which created CONADI, the National Corporation for Indigenous Development, to protect indigenous lands and promote culture. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, the law was weak, underfunded, and often ignored. It recognized indigenous peoples but didn't grant significant autonomy or rights. It was the minimum the Chilean government could do to appear progressive while changing as little as possible. Fact 70. The Ralco Dam. In the 1990s, the Chilean government and an energy company planned to build the Ralco Dam on the Bio River, which would flood Pehuenche communities and their lands. The Pehuenche resisted, saying the dam would destroy their territories and sacred sites. Activist Nicolasa Quinterman became the face of resistance, refusing to sell her land. The conflict exposed the weakness of indigenous rights laws. Konati opposed the dam, but the government overruled it. The dam was built, communities were flooded, people were forcibly relocated. It showed that even in democracy, when indigenous rights conflicted with economic interests, indigenous rights lost. Fact 71. The Mapuche movement grows. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the Mapuche movement grew stronger and more visible. New organizations emerged, using different tactics. Some pursued legal strategies, using national and international law to defend rights. Others occupied forestry lands, burning equipment and reclaiming territory. Some focused on cultural revival, establishing Mapuche schools and media. The movement wasn't unified. Different groups had different strategies, sometimes conflicting. But this diversity was also strength. The Chilean state couldn't address Mapuche demands by co-opting a single leader or organization because there wasn't one. The movement was decentralized, like Mapuche society itself. And so, with images of forests replaced by pine plantations, of communities flooding behind dams, of activists meeting in secret under dictatorship's shadow, and of a movement growing despite everything, spreading like roots beneath the surface, we rest here, letting these modern struggles settle around us, understanding that the story of resistance hasn't ended, that it continues in different forms, that each generation finds its own way to say we are still here. Fact 72. The Coordinadora Arauco Maliko. In 1998, a more militant organization called the Coordinadora Arauco Maliko, CAM, was founded. They advocated for territorial control and autonomy, using tactics including land occupations and sabotage of forestry equipment. The Chilean government labeled them terrorists, a loaded term that justified harsh crackdowns. But CAM saw themselves as freedom fighters reclaiming stolen land, using the only tactics that seemed effective when legal channels consistently failed. Their actions were controversial even within the Mapuche community, but they forced Chilean society to acknowledge that the Mapuche problem hadn't been solved, that the wound of dispossession still bled. Fact 73. The Anti-Terrorism Law. The Chilean government began using Pinochet-era anti-terrorism laws against Mapuche activists. These laws allowed secret witnesses, reduced rights of the accused, and increased penalties. Indigenous activists occupying land were tried as terrorists, facing years in prison for acts that, in other contexts, would be treated as civil disobedience. International human rights organizations condemned these practices, but Chile continued. The use of anti-terrorism laws against indigenous land defenders drew international attention to the Mapuche struggle, making it harder for Chile to present itself as a modern democracy while treating its indigenous people as enemies of the state. Fact 74. Matias Catrillo. In 2008, Mapuche student and activist Matias Catrillo was shot and killed by a police officer during a land occupation. He was 22 years old. His death sparked protests across Chile and internationally. Catrillo became a symbol of Mapuche resistance, his face appearing on murals and posters. His death illustrated the violence Mapuche activists faced, the willingness of the state to use lethal force against people reclaiming ancestral lands. But it also showed that violence couldn't silence the movement. If anything, martyrs like Catrillo inspired more young Mapuche to join the struggle. Fact 75. Hunger strikes. Mapuche political prisoners have used hunger strikes as a form of protest, demanding fair trials and an end to anti-terrorism laws. These strikes, some lasting months, brought international attention and put pressure on the Chilean government. Hunger strikes transformed prisoners into moral witnesses, their suffering bodies testifying to injustice. Families and communities rallied around strikers, holding vigils and protests. The Chilean government often made concessions to end hunger strikes, though rarely addressing the underlying issues. Each hunger strike was a reminder that Mapuche resistance could take forms that bullets couldn't stop. Fact 76. The Mapuche language revival. In recent decades, there's been a conscious effort to revitalize Mapudungun. Schools teaching in Mapudungun have been established. Language programs, dictionaries, and learning apps have been created. Young urban Mapuche who grew up speaking only Spanish are learning their ancestral language. Hip-hop artists rap in Mapudungun. Poets write in it. The language, which seemed endangered just decades ago, is experiencing a renaissance. Every child who learns to say Mari Mari instead of just Hola, every young person who can understand their grandmother's stories in the original language, is an act of cultural reclamation. Fact 77. Mapuche media. Mapuche communities have developed their own media outlets, radio stations, websites, social media channels that tell stories from Mapuche perspectives, in Mapudungun and Spanish. This is crucial because mainstream Chilean media often portrays Mapuche activists negatively, focusing on conflict while ignoring context. Mapuche media tells different stories, of communities defending sacred sites, of cultural revival, of daily life in Mapuche communities. Control of narrative is a form of resistance. When you can tell your own story, you're harder to define and control. Fact 78. International solidarity. The Mapuche struggle has gained international support. Indigenous groups from around the world have expressed solidarity. Environmental groups have joined campaigns against forestry companies. Human rights organizations document abuses. When Mapuche representatives speak at the United Nations or meet with international NGOs, they're using global forums that didn't exist for earlier generations. This internationalization has given the movement more leverage, making it harder for Chile to suppress it quietly. The world is watching, and that attention provides some protection. Fact 79. The 2019 social uprising. In October 2019, Chile exploded in massive protests against inequality, privatization, and the lingering legacy of the Pinochet era. Mapuche activists and symbols were prominent in these protests. The Mapuche flag flew alongside Chilean flags. Protesters sang Mapuche songs and chanted indigenous slogans. The social uprising showed that Mapuche grievances were connected to broader Chilean grievances, that the same systems that dispossessed indigenous peoples also exploited non-indigenous poor. The Mapuche struggle wasn't separate from other struggles for justice in Chile. They were all fighting the same system. Fact 80. The Constitutional Convention. Out of the 2019 uprising came an agreement to write a new constitution. Elections for the Constitutional Convention in 2021 reserved 17 seats for indigenous peoples, including 10 for Mapuche representatives. For the first time in Chilean history, indigenous peoples had guaranteed representation in defining the nation's fundamental law. Mapuche constitutional delegates advocated for plurinationalism, recognizing Chile as composed of multiple nations, for indigenous autonomy, land rights, and water rights. The draft constitution that emerged recognized indigenous rights more strongly than any previous Chilean legal document. Fact 81. The constitutional rejection. In September 2022, Chileans voted on the new constitution. It was rejected by a 62% majority. Multiple factors contributed. The constitution was long and complex. Conservative groups ran effective fear campaigns. Some voters felt it went too far in various directions. The rejection was devastating for many Mapuche activists who had hoped for constitutional recognition of their rights. But it wasn't the end. A second constitutional process began, and the struggle for constitutional recognition continues. The fact that indigenous rights were even on the table in national constitutional debates represented progress from earlier eras when they weren't discussed at all. And so, with images of prisoners refusing food for justice, of young people learning the language their grandparents were punished for speaking, of flags flying side by side in protests that shake the nation, and of an ongoing struggle that adapts, persists, and refuses to end, we rest here, letting these contemporary threads weave through our thoughts, understanding that this story isn't history. It's happening now. It's being written today. Fact 82. Camilo Catrillanca. In 2018, Camilo Catrillanca, a young Mapuche community leader and farmer, was shot and killed by Chilean police during an operation in Araucania. He was 24 years old, driving a tractor, unarmed. Police initially claimed he was a criminal, but video evidence showed they had executed him and tried to cover it up. His death sparked massive protests and became another rallying point for the Mapuche movement. Each such killing deepens the wound, but also strengthens resolve. The names of the fallen, Catrillo, Catrillanca, and others, are remembered, honored, and become fuel for continued struggle. Fact 83. The Mapuche Francisca Lincaneo. Mapuche Francisca Lincaneo became a prominent figure in Mapuche resistance. In 2013, at age 65, she was arrested and accused of involvement in attacks on forestry companies. She spent years under house arrest, facing trial under anti-terrorism laws. As a Mapuche, she represented both spiritual authority and resistance to state power. Her case drew international attention. She became a symbol of how the Chilean state criminalized not just activists but traditional spiritual leaders. In 2018, she was finally acquitted. Her resilience showed that even in old age, even facing the power of the state, Mapuche spiritual leaders continue their role as defenders of their people. Fact 84. Land recuperation. Across Araucania and other regions, Mapuche communities continue recuperation de tierras, land recuperation. They occupy territories they consider ancestrally theirs, establishing communities, planting crops, building ruca. These occupations are technically illegal under Chilean law, but from the Mapuche perspective, they're reclaiming what was stolen. Some occupations are violent, others peaceful. Some last days, others years. Each one is an assertion that the land question isn't settled, that Mapuche haven't accepted their dispossession, that they will continue pressing their claim until justice is done. Fact 85. Water rights. Water has become a critical issue. Chile's water code, established under Pinochet, privatized water rights, allowing companies to own water sources. In Mapuche territories, forestry companies and agricultural operations have bought water rights, leaving communities without access to traditional water sources. Springs that sustained communities for generations dry up as companies drain aquifers. The Mapuche fight for water is both practical, needing water to survive, and spiritual. Water sources have Ngen spirits. They're sacred. They can't be bought and sold like commodities. The struggle for water rights is a struggle over two completely incompatible ways of understanding the relationship between humans and nature. Fact 86. The Wenyufoy flag. The Mapuche flag, called Wenyufoy or Wenyufoy, has become a powerful symbol of identity and resistance. It features a blue and white design with a central star, colors representing sky and clouds, symbols representing the sun, moon, and ancestral spirits. You see it at protests, painted on walls, flying from houses in Mapuche communities. During the 2019 uprising, it flew throughout Chile, not just in Mapuche territories. The flag's presence is a declaration. We are here, we haven't disappeared, we claim this space. It's a banner that would have made Lautaro proud, carrying forward the resistance he began almost 500 years ago. Fact 87. Mapuche intellectuals. A generation of Mapuche intellectuals has emerged. Historians, poets, anthropologists, lawyers, educators who are Mapuche themselves, writing about their own history and culture from inside perspectives. They're reclaiming narrative, correcting histories written by outsiders, asserting Mapuche epistemology, Mapuche ways of knowing. Writers like Elicura Chihuelaf, the first Mapuche to win Chile's National Prize for Literature. Activists like Milare Huichalaf. These intellectuals are creating knowledge that serves their communities, that strengthens identity, that provides theoretical frameworks for resistance. The battle of ideas is as important as the battle for land. Fact 88. Contemporary challenges. Today's Mapuche communities face complex challenges. Poverty rates remain high. Educational outcomes lag behind national averages. Healthcare is often inadequate. Young people leave communities for cities, seeking opportunities, sometimes losing cultural connection. Climate change affects traditional lands. Drug trafficking has entered some communities, bringing violence and corruption. Internal divisions exist over tactics and goals. These challenges are real and serious. But communities also show resilience, creativity, and determination. They're not waiting for the Chilean government to solve their problems. They're building solutions themselves. Fact 89. Mapuche in popular culture. Mapuche culture has gained more visibility in Chilean popular culture. Musicians blend traditional Mapuche instruments like the Cultran drum and Trutruca horn with modern genres. Filmmakers tell Mapuche stories. Chefs celebrate Mapuche cuisine. Fashion designers incorporate Mapuche textiles and designs. This visibility is double-edged. It can be appreciation or appropriation, recognition or commodification. But it also means young Chileans are growing up with more awareness of Mapuche culture, seeing it as valuable rather than something to erase. Cultural visibility can create space for political recognition. Fact 90. The youth movement. Young Mapuche are leading much of the current resistance. They're digital natives, using social media to organize, document, and publicize their struggles. They're creating music, art, and media that's both traditionally Mapuche and contemporary. They're proud of their identity in ways their grandparents' generation sometimes couldn't be. They've grown up with stories of dispossession and resistance, and they're determined to write the next chapter differently. They see themselves as part of global indigenous movements, connected to struggles from Standing Rock to the Amazon. This generation won't accept what previous generations were forced to accept. Fact 91. Autonomy demands. Many Mapuche organizations now demand autonomy, the right to self-governance within their territories. They point to international examples: indigenous autonomy in places like Bolivia, Canada's First Nations, New Zealand's relationship with Maori. They argue that Chile's centralized government can't meet Mapuche needs, that only Mapuche can govern themselves effectively. These demands make many Chileans nervous, raising fears of separatism. But Mapuche advocates argue they're not seeking to leave Chile but to exist within it on their own terms, with control over their lands, resources, and futures. The debate over autonomy will likely define the next chapter of Mapuche-Chilean relations. And so, with images of flags flying in defiance, of young people creating art that honors ancestors while speaking to the present, of communities reclaiming land and water and identity, and of a future still being fought for, still being imagined, still unwritten, we rest here, understanding that resistance has no ending, only transformations. That each generation adds its verse to a song that began before memory and continues beyond sight. Fact 92. The role of women. Mapuche women have always been central to resistance. Traditionally, they were weavers, passing culture through textiles. They were teachers, ensuring language and tradition survived. Today, women are often at the forefront of land defense, of political organizing, of cultural preservation. The Maki are predominantly women. Many spokespersons and leaders are women. Women like Nicolasa Quinterman standing against the dam, like Francisca Lincolneo facing trial with dignity. Mapuche resistance isn't just sustained by warriors. It's sustained by mothers teaching children, by weavers keeping patterns alive, by women who understand that defending land and defending culture are the same struggle. Fact 93. The cost of resistance. Resistance has always carried costs. Mapuche activists face imprisonment, violence, surveillance, and harassment. Their families are threatened. They lose jobs, education opportunities, sometimes their lives. Children grow up with parents in prison. Communities face militarized police operations. The psychological toll of constant struggle, of facing a powerful state with limited resources, is immense. Yet people continue resisting, knowing the costs, accepting them. Because the alternative, accepting dispossession, allowing their identity to be erased, betraying their ancestors, costs more. Some prices are worth paying. Fact 94. International Indigenous Rights. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, provides an international framework for indigenous rights. It recognizes indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, resources, culture, and self-determination. Chile endorsed the declaration but has been inconsistent in implementing it. Mapuche activists use international law to pressure Chile, taking cases to international human rights bodies. These international mechanisms don't always produce results, but they create another arena for struggle, another source of legitimacy for Mapuche demands. The fight for justice happens in multiple forums simultaneously. Fact 95. The question of reconciliation. Can there be reconciliation between the Chilean state and the Mapuche people? Some believe reconciliation is possible through truth-telling, land restitution, and genuine autonomy. Others believe the relationship is fundamentally colonial and can't be reformed, only replaced. Chile has never had a truth commission addressing the historical dispossession and violence against the Mapuche, unlike commissions addressing Pinochet-era crimes. Without acknowledging the full scope of historical injustice, can there be genuine reconciliation? Or is reconciliation just another way to convince the Mapuche to accept what was stolen? These questions remain unresolved, debated within Mapuche communities and Chilean society. Fact 96. Mapuche diaspora. Mapuche communities exist beyond their traditional territories. In Santiago, Buenos Aires, and cities worldwide, Mapuche maintain their identity. Urban Mapuche communities create new forms of cultural expression, adapting traditions to city life. Some face criticism from rural communities for being less authentic, but they argue they're simply being Mapuche in different contexts. The diaspora also spreads awareness, creates networks of support, and brings Mapuche perspectives into spaces they historically couldn't access. Identity isn't just about where you live. It's about how you live, what you remember, who you choose to be. Fact 97. Environmental defenders. In recent years, international environmental organizations have recognized the Mapuche as crucial environmental defenders. Their traditional territories contain some of Chile's last native forests, vital water sources, and biodiversity hotspots. The Mapuche relationship with land, based on respect and reciprocity rather than exploitation, represents an alternative to the extractive model that's destroying ecosystems globally. As climate change accelerates, indigenous knowledge about sustainable land management becomes more valuable. The Mapuche aren't just fighting for themselves. They're fighting for ecosystems, for biodiversity, for futures that benefit everyone. Fact 98. The unfinished story. The Mapuche story isn't finished. Right now, today, communities are defending territories, teaching children Mapudungun, holding ceremonies, organizing protests, negotiating with government officials, planting crops on recuperated lands, weaving textiles, singing traditional songs. The struggle that began with resisting the Inca, that continued through Spanish colonialism and Chilean conquest, that survived dictatorship and democracy, continues. It transforms, it adapts, but it doesn't end. Because as long as there are people who call themselves Mapuche, who remember their history, who love their land, the story continues. Fact 99. The power of land. Throughout this journey, one thread runs constant: land. Not land as property, as commodity, as resource to exploit, but land as identity, as mother, as sacred trust. The Mapuche are people of the land, and that relationship defines everything. When they fight for territory, they're not just fighting for acres and resources. They're fighting for the basis of their existence, for their connection to ancestors, for the foundation of their culture. Understanding this is understanding the Mapuche. You can't separate them from their land any more than you can separate a tree from its roots. The land is them, and they are the land, and that bond is what 500 years of colonialism couldn't break. Fact 100. The eternal return. In Mapuche cosmology, time isn't linear but cyclical. What was will be again. The ancestors aren't gone. They're present, watching, waiting. The warriors of the past. Lautaro, Quilipan, all the unnamed thousands who fought and died defending their land. They haven't disappeared. They live in memory, in stories, in the courage of each new generation that takes up the struggle. When a young Mapuche activist stands in front of police lines, or when a child learns their first words in Mapudungun, or when a community plants corn on recuperated land, the past returns. The resistance that began centuries ago continues today, and it will continue tomorrow. As long as injustice persists, resistance will answer. The story circles back on itself, eternal, unbreaking, like the seasons, like the cycles of planting and harvest, like the generations that follow one another, each adding their chapter to a story that has no end, only continuations. And so our journey through Mapuche history comes to rest. Though the story itself doesn't rest, can't rest, won't rest until justice is done. We've walked from ancient forests where spirits dwell to modern streets where flags fly in protest. We've seen empires fail to conquer. We've witnessed dispossession and resistance. We've felt the weight of loss and the strength of persistence. As you drift toward sleep, let these images settle gently. The she-wolf who nursed Rome's founders has her counterpart in the Ngen spirits watching over Mapuche lands. Alexander's empire fell, but the Mapuche endured what neither Inca nor Spanish could break. The power isn't always in conquest. Sometimes it's in surviving, in refusing to disappear, in being yourself when the world insists you become someone else. Sleep well, dreaming of ancient forests and unbroken threads, of a language that survived everything, of resistance that takes 1,000 forms, of people who are their land, of the Mapuche, of those who persist, of the story that isn't over.